Welcome to the Dr. Berkson's Best Health Radio Show. And today is March 23rd, 2021, and this has been a really sad week for America. I mean, America is in trouble. We've had 2 mass shootings in 1 week. If you don't think that anger and short-triggered angst is ruling the waves of our cultural times, something's not right. We had the deaths of 6 Asian women in a spa, and yesterday at a supermarket, just shopping at a supermarket, we had 10 deaths. And then we have women taking offense at Cuomo, who I thought did such an elegant job at the beginning of the pandemic because of the way he looks at them. So we have a lot of trigger anger, and I'm going to ask our guest today as part of our topic of why I opened up with that, because we have one of the major moving forces of the paleo diet on the show today. So I'm going to be asking Robb Wolf, who we could say is one of the main paleontologists, if you might, what he thinks about the role of food in the American diet with all this anger. So let me just introduce him, because then I want to dive into this great dialogue that you're going to be on the edge of your seat or walking around Quarry Lake by my home, wherever you are. You're not going to want to miss this show, because I can't wait to hear what erupts from our conversation. So Robb Wolf is really a hero of mine that I've wanted to have on the show for a while. So I'm so grateful for him for coming on. He's a former research biochemist, and he is a 2 times New York Times bestselling author. So he had 2 books that are fabulous books. The first one was The Paleo Solution, and the next was Wired to Eat. In fact, he has 2 podcasts, and we're going to ask him later on, how is it you have 2 podcasts? What are the difference, and who should listen to what? But the bottom line is that through food, with every decision being a fork in the road, Robb has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people through food. And he's got a podcast. I think both of them are top-ranked iTunes podcasters, where he just keeps serving humanity and pumping out information about the importance of food. He's functioned as a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism and a consultant for the Naval Special Warfare Resiliency Program. And we all know that we talk on the show about vitamin R. Resiliency. That's what it's all about. Because you all know that I'm a crusty old fart, and I need to be resilient to keep doing all that I'm doing. Robb serves on the board of director advisors for Specialty Health and Company, and he's also done a number of really interesting things. He has a purple belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and is a former California state powerlifting champion. He goes on to say he squat lifted 565 pounds and bench pressed 565 pounds. Even
Nope, 345.
Okay. What was that bench then? It says bench.
The bench squat and deadlift 565 and bench 345. Yeah.
Boy, it's a lot of weight. And the other thing is he really has worked for a number of incredible entities, giving workshops on nutrition, strength, conditioning, all the things that give a human body resilience. So he's given these amazing seminars for NASA, for the Naval Special Warfare, the Canadian Light Infantry. I've never been asked to lecture for the Canadian Light Infantry and the United States Marine Corps. And he lived for many years close to where I am with his wife, Nikki. And I just need to make a little comment, because usually there's a great woman behind a great guy, but these 2 are side by side. So I want to get Nikki on the show sometime. He's married to an amazing woman, and together, they're passing great information forward. So Nikki Violetti has founded CrossFit NorCal, the 4th CrossFit affiliate, and she's done so many things. She's noted for her development of the on-ramp concept and program publishing in a 2-part series in the performance menu. I mean, she is a powerhouse, and they've got 2 kids together. So they're really a family that's living and looking at every way we can develop better resilience. And maybe that will trickle down into our country, which is in trouble. So let me lead back to the opening question, Robb, and then we're going to let you take over most of the talking of the show. How much do you think what's going on in America is related to what we're putting on our plates and into our mouths?
Oh man, it is a really good question, and it's nice to talk about the protein, carb, fat topic, but in kind of a broader context. But I will say this: the power of this kind of paleo template, or what we call the overarching ancestral health model, it goes beyond food. And I think that so many of the problems that we face are a really direct outgrowth of how far removed we are from kind of these ancestral origins. You could argue, do very, very well in small extended family groups. And even up until maybe 150 years ago, it was rare that someone traveled much more than about 20 miles away from their home. And some people will say, well, that would be horrible. I don't want to be home with my family all that time. And there can definitely be pluses and minuses to that. But there is kind of a reality that as we've become more mobile and we can do different things for work, and we can live just about anywhere that you want to live because of teleconferencing and just even if you're more in a trade, like if you are living in California and you want to move to Michigan, like you people do that now. And I think that it's really great in a lot of ways. It can be very powerful for economic reasons, but we end up being very lonely and isolated. And this is, I think, one of these key underpinnings of this ancestral health model. So although I have no doubt that feeling bad due to a poor diet is a big factor in this, I would argue that the lack of community and the lack of connectivity that we have is a major additional, problem, malaise that we face. And I'm not entirely sure how to fix that. I do think that this is where when people plug into something like a CrossFit gym, a church, a jiu-jitsu, martial arts, something like that, where they've got some really tight community, they get a lot from that experience, and it I think that it goes a long way towards kind of relieving the pressure valve of these emotions that people build up. It's worth mentioning that a lot of people end up on different types of antidepressant medications, and there's a lot of linkage between that and these, really aberrant, spontaneous behaviors, like in these different mass shootings and whatnot. So I think that there's a lot, but I would, as much as I am kind of the food guy, I think that it's really worth mentioning or worth exploring that it's all of this stuff. It's the whole package. As incredible as it is that we get to connect via this medium, for so many people, in this age of COVID, talking to people via video conference is the closest thing that they have to community. And man, it's social media and online teleconferencing are to community what junk food is to real food. Like it'll keep you alive. It'll keep you going. It's better than not having anything, but I don't know that it really, it fills us in the way that we really need to be enriched and nourished on all these different, planes and levels.
Have you found that people who do start to have more mindfulness over eating, and we're going to dive in a few minutes into what is the paleo diet and how did you get started in this? And I have a number of questions about some of the criticisms about it. Do you find that people who get attracted to looking at the power of food tend to be people who also link up more with a few people to create a community because they're conscious of a bigger picture? Does that relate accurately to you or not?
It seems like it. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting in my experience, people tend to do dietary exploration for kind of one of two primary reasons. And it's interesting because they're kind of at different ends of a spectrum. On the one hand, it'll be someone like me who was suffering a significant health crisis. When I was 26, 27, I had ulcerative colitis so bad that I was facing a bowel resection and was really very ill. I'm about 165, 170 pounds right now. I got down to 125 pounds from malabsorption issues from the ulcerative colitis. So I was really in bad shape. And it was kind of an act of desperation that I started exploring these kind of low carb, ketogenic, paleo type diets. And it for me was a lifesaver. The other group of people that we see really explore dietary change, whether it's paleo or vegan or what have you, tend to be the really high end performers. They're either competitive athletes, people in the police, military, fire, or just somebody for whom their physical and mental performance is critically important, and they want to take things the next step. And oftentimes when you change dietary behaviors, ironically, that can be a socially isolating process. Like all of a sudden you're kind of the burr under the saddle at family gatherings and stuff like that. So you may be doing something to improve your personal nutrition related health. And then you find that it complicates sometimes your social interactions, which is also critical to health. And so that has been maybe one of the cool things about social media, is that people can find folks from all over the world. It doesn't matter what, dietary walk of life you subscribe to. You can find people that you can get some sense of community with. We have everything from raw vegan to carnivore these days, and people can find folks that they can connect with and share stories, share experiences, and not infrequently then they are able to build some in real life community from that.
That's interesting. When I first got into this many years ago and wasn't eating as much meat, I was just changing my diet around and presented this at a family gathering to my parents and cousins and aunts and uncles. They just assumed I was off in a commune doing drugs and having sex with multiple partners. They just assumed anything different meant that it was really exotic but bad.
Right.
So that's interesting. And I'm going to want to ask you your opinion of the carnivore diet and the vegan diet down the road. But can you tell us what exactly is the paleo diet?
It's you could look at it either by inclusion or exclusion. The exclusion is it generally involves eating in a way that avoids, for the most part, grains, legumes, and dairy. And so what's left by extension then, seafood, different types of meat and animal products, fruits, vegetables, root shoots, and tubers. This work was developed largely by observing what anthropologists had recorded still existing hunter-gatherers consuming. So there's, forgetting the exact name of it, but it's this giant compendium, the Anthropological Cultural Atlas, but it details all these different peoples around the world, and it has huge amounts of information, but it digs into their dietary practices. So there were about 260 hunter-gatherer groups that were pretty well studied in this atlas. And there was kind of a spectrum of what types of foods that they ate. And Lauren Cordain got in and looked at that material, kind of did a distribution of, how much protein, carbs, fat they ate, what were the rough sources that they came from. And what we found is that for a small percentage of the hunter-gatherer groups, some of them ate quite a lot of animal protein, like the Inuit or the Aceh Indians of Peru, because they live in areas where there's very little vegetable matter. And then you have other people like the Katavans of Papua New Guinea, who eat about a 70% carbohydrate diet, mainly from sweet potatoes and fruit. And then they round that out with different hunted and gathered animals, lots of seafood because they're in an island situation and whatnot. But then in the middle of that bell curve, there was this kind of thing that looks a lot like the zone diet. It was kind of roughly equal amounts of protein, carbs, fat that were from whole food sources. And so one of the challenges of a paleo diet is that it's hard to define exactly what it is. And I think that this is part of the reason why ketogenic diets have really become very popular in research circles, because it's anything that gets you into a state of ketosis. And we can measure that. If you have a 0.5 millimolar or higher beta hydroxybutyrate blood level, then you're in a ketogenic state. And so it's very amenable for scientists to study it. We've had a good number of studies around the paleo diet, but again, the question that inevitably would pop up is, well, what exactly were they eating? How much protein, carbs, fat, and all that type of stuff, which I think gets a little bit reductionist and not super helpful in many ways, but science is what it is. And so, although research in and around the paleo diet continues, it has really shifted more into kind of low carb type diets. But I would say that the paleo diet really put on many people's radar the importance of gut health. Like the gut health topic was really not a topic of discussion 10, 15 years ago in the paleo
I
diet.
did write a book on it. My book came out published by Wiley 22 years ago, the gut nutrition body mind book called Healthy Digestion the Natural Way. It was in the science, but what you're saying, it wasn't in the clinical trenches or the cultural mindset. And you've helped bring it there. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's phenomenal that you were so far ahead of the curve on that. I'm trying to think of what other, so like gut health really got put on the radar, I would say, with the advent of the paleo diet, and also just a recognition that there are what we would call immunogenic foods, things like gluten or dairy, or can really be a wide variety of foods now that can cause GI or autoimmune related problems for many people. And so I think that is, again, like there have been elimination diets for a very long time. The specific carbohydrate diet, and there's quite a number of them. And really, when you look at them closely, they look a heck of a lot like a paleo diet. Like they're kind of low carb. Some remove starches, some remove fruit, some remove both starches and fruit, some remove nightshades like tomatoes and eggplants and whatnot. But there have been elimination diets for quite some time, and they all kind of hover around this idea that for some people, they really need to mind their carbohydrate amount and also the source. And that tends to be kind of the main problem that folks face. Some people find some problems with dairy. Other people find some problems with shellfish and whatnot. But, I don't know if I'm perfectly answering the question around what a paleo diet is, but this is kind of some of the broad brushstrokes of, I think, where the paleo diet concept has kind of infiltrated modern nutrition and the way that people look at health and disease.
So paleo stands for, it was based on hunter-gatherer eating. And so it's great because it's less processed food. But why is it that the way they ate better for us now? I'm going to talk to you in just a little bit. It wasn't until I added a lot more carbs, of course, non-processed carbs, because I was trying to eat in so many of these other ways, but it didn't work for me. And I'm going to talk to you about that molecule in particular that was my bugaboo. That there are several studies in PubMed show the paleo diet increases that molecule, and it's very up for grabs exactly what that means. But for me, it was a lifesaver adding more carbohydrates. So why is it that a hunter-gatherer diet from way back when would be the way that we today should use as our guideline to eat? Can you explain that to me a little bit better?
Really good question. And this was based around this idea of the discordance hypothesis, which is this idea that any organism living in a given environment tends to be somewhat optimized for the situation that it's in. There's not 100% uniformity in this. Like, as an example, the giant panda in China, it used to be an omnivorous organism like most bears. It would eat plants and animals. And at some point, for some reason in evolutionary history, it decided to make bamboo its sole source of nutrition. And it's been doing this about 300,000 years, and it is still suffering problems as a consequence. It has really massive digestive distress and issues, and it's not actually a very resilient or adaptable organism. And so 300,000 years is quite a long time to adapt to something, but it can sometimes take even longer than that. There's a fascinating article I can forward to you about this kind of still diet genetics mismatch that explains the problems that the giant panda has. But for humans, virtually all humans up until about 10,000 years ago were effectively hunter-gatherers. And this is where people start getting crazy. They'll say, well, there's evidence that there was some amount of grain consumption in Mesopotamia, 15,000 years ago. It's like, okay, it's 15, not 10 for this group. But it's a general guideline there. And what's interesting is when anthropologists and archaeologists have looked at the skeletal remains of hunter-gatherers, they tend to be very big, strong, robust. Like, we can tell by the muscle attachments on bones how physically active and strong people were. And the average person that we find in these kind of hunter-gatherer remains, they have the physique, both men and women and children and the aged, of basically professional athletes. So there's something interesting about that. Like they seem to be very healthy, very robust. In contemporarily studied hunter-gatherers, and also it's well understood within our more distant forebears, the average lifespan was about 30 years old. And this is where some people will say, well, why would we want to eat in a way that supports people only living to be 30 years old? But what's missed in that story is that these people had no medical interventions. We had a very high infant mortality rate. But if people lived to the age of 30, they were as likely to live into their 70s and 80s as we are. And this is absent any type of modern medical intervention. And the basic idea there was also kind of drawing from the reality that the 20th century really was a turning point in which the bulk of our morbidity and mortality, our disease and death, shifted from communicable or infectious disease to diseases of affluence, cancer, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease. These things are unknown in the developing world for the most part. It's only when they start eating a more westernized diet that we see these problems emerge. And
they used to be just in the elderly. We called them chronic degenerative disease of the aged. And now my ex in the ER would see 7-year-olds with high blood pressure and elevated cholesterol having the same things we thought older people would only get. So there's been a shift where most of our people are sick today, young and old.
When you and I grew up, there was this thing called juvenile diabetes, which was type 1 diabetes, and type 2 diabetes in children was literally unknown.
Right.
It didn't exist. And so this is kind of, again, this is one of these things where it's kind of unfortunate that the paleo term was the term that was latched onto this vehicle. It should have been ancestral or evolutionary diet or something like that, because you don't have to eat a nuts and bolts Paleolithic diet to experience the benefits of avoiding the diseases of modernity from eating a modern processed diet. But this is kind of the hows, whys, and what's its with where this came from, is acknowledging that our modern diet is so here's kind of an interesting thing. Hunter-gatherers were on average taller and more robustly built than their say like 150 years ago than their Western contemporaries. If you go to Europe, the doorways that you go into buildings, it was the average height of men in pre-Victorian Europe was 5'4". Women, it was like 5'2". And so when these people came to the Americas and you had these free living hunter-gatherer Native Americans, they thought they were giants, and they were by comparison. The average height of a Navajo warrior was 6 feet tall. And what is interesting is when an organism...
It would be good on Match.com, because all the women want to know the men's height.
they want to, and they want it to, whatever it is, they want it taller. Yeah.
Right.
And what's interesting is we saw a dramatic decrease in height shifting from a hunter-gatherer diet to a more, grain-based diet for several hundred years. And then slowly, as the United States and the West kind of industrialized and our food quality improved, over the last 70 years, the United States has seen a general trend upward in height until about 5 years ago. And now we are trending back down again. And height is one of these interesting things. The current generation of kids, or maybe even the generation immediately before me or behind me, I guess, they are predicted that they will live shorter lives than what their parents did.
First time ever.
Yeah.
Right. Can you give people, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but just to give people an idea of what you're talking about with the paleo diet, can you tell us what you ate yesterday, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so they have in their heads while they're listening to the benefits of this, they have a little bit of an understanding in case they didn't know? Can you give that?
Let's see. So like today I had some leftover steak and some blueberries, a big pile of pecans, and then I probably won't eat again until dinner. And I think tonight we're going to have like a chicken soup with carrots and onions and cabbage. My girls and my wife handle carbs much better than I do, so they'll do some potatoes and they'll do some rice and stuff like that. So we kind of so I cook some of that other stuff, but we usually have kind of a protein and veggie centric main course. And then for my wife and kids who handle carbs better than I do, we might have some rice, potatoes, sweet potatoes. I'm super gluten intolerant. I have celiac. So we are a 100% gluten-free family. Occasionally the kids will have a little gluten if we eat out or they get to a kid's birthday party or something. But I was much more gluten tolerant as a kid. And then that went away with repeated exposure as I aged. And so I'm just kind of punting all that type of stuff with my kids. But I mean, those are pretty typical days. It's kind of the funny thing is people will say, well, I could never eat a paleo diet. And I'm like, okay, have you ever had eggs and fruit for breakfast? And they're like, well, yeah, of course I've had eggs and fruit for breakfast. Have you ever had like a salmon salad for lunch? Yeah, I've had salmon salad for lunch. Have you ever had ribs and a glass of wine and some grilled asparagus for dinner? Yeah. People have eaten thousands of paleo meals. They just tend not to string them together more days than not. And I'm not a religious zealot about it other than the gluten side. Like that's really a non-negotiable feature for me, but I try to have as much dietary latitude as I can, above and beyond that. And that's what I recommend that most people do too. I really like the paleo diet as a reset. It's kind of like when you're a little kid and you're playing tag, you have like a safe home base. That's a great safe home base for resetting. And then it's,
that's a good way to put it.
Such
a good way to put it.
Yeah. And it's not such a commitment, it's like just if you feel totally optimized and you're the body weight you want to be in, body composition, then you don't need me. But if you've got some problems, then I like that paleo diet as a beginning place. Then we can rotate. Many people have never gone a week, to say nothing of a month, without wheat or dairy or, some of these potentially pro-inflammatory foods, or even just getting a handle on their total carbohydrate load. And so this is some of the stuff that, again, I like to use as a reset point. And then we reintroduce these foods, see how people do, and then they kind of motor from there.
Kind of like an elimination diet, right?
Very much. Yeah.
So
yeah.
I completely understand with gluten because we know we've taken in studies published in Nutrients and in other peer-reviewed journals, they've taken little snippets of people's gut wall that don't have any problem with gluten and people who have allergies and people who have celiac, an immune disorder against gluten-containing protein foods. And every single person makes a little bit of an inflammation, but some people can make an anti-inflammatory. The interleukin 10 comes marching to the rescue and they don't have a problem, but many of us do. I have problems with gluten, and I can see also that dairy is a pro-inflammatory food, but walk me through, please, if you would, what's wrong with some of the grains like quinoa, or what is going on with legumes, pulses, as they call them in India when I lived in India, because many people are vegetarian there and consume those foods. Can you chat a bit about that?
Yeah. So all of these foods have these plant type foods have anti-predation chemicals in them. So if in nature, fruit is maybe one of the only situations where we have this interesting trade-off where the plant will make some of itself with the expectation that it's going to be eaten, but it's in a collaborative process where the animal will consume the seeds and then deposit the seeds in a warm fertilized package somewhere else. So there's some symbiosis there. With grains and legumes, they are the reproductive structure of the plant, and they're actually remarkably toxic if not consumed properly. So there's an interesting example where quinoa is very rich in saponins. It's this soap-like substance that actually irritates the gut wall. And most people, when they prepare quinoa, they soak it and then rinse it and soak it and rinse it. And this really helps to minimize the saponin problem. Some researchers developed a low saponin variety of quinoa. And the problem that they had is that they couldn't produce it in the field because all the birds ate all of it, because it had reduced the saponin levels to such low levels that it was basically providing a type of like processed bird food. The birds super preferred that because it didn't have these anti-predation chemicals in them. And when we look at the way that grains and legumes in particular have been prepared in traditional cultures, they will soak, sprout, ferment, sometimes for days, occasionally even a week or longer, to remove some of these toxic substances. So again, this is a situation where our modern food systems, we don't do any of those things.
What about the lentils and the foods like that? Are you suggesting to do that with lentils and garbanzo beans and chickpeas and things like that?
Absolutely.
Too?
Yeah. And this is where the folks like at the Weston A. Price Foundation are very good about talking about the way that traditional cultures have modified these plant foods. Yucca or taro root is a kind of a
I've been
staple
cooking that a lot lately. Interestingly enough, I've been making my own little version of healthy fries with yucca because it has so much more resistant starch, and that's been one of my little summer food fun projects.
It also has a lot of cyanide in it, and if you don't cook it properly, it can kill you. or if it takes over too much of your diet, it can become very, very problematic. And so traditional cultures are very careful in the way that they peel the yucca. They tend to cook it for a very long time at reasonably low temperatures, ironically, which tends to degrade the cyanide. So the anti-predation chemicals tend to either be some sort of an immunogenic protein, a type of protein that irritates the gut lining or can cause systemic inflammation, usually something like a cyanide type substance like stone fruit seeds are very rich in cyanide, apple seeds, plums, cherries. There's a Polish type of liquor called kirsch, which is fermented and distilled cherries. And it's interesting. It has a slight almond flavor to it. And that almond flavor is actually a tiny little bit of cyanide that makes its way through that whole process. A little bit isn't that big of a deal, but it's the really large amounts that can get people. And then saponins, which banana peels and quinoa are very, very rich in saponins, which are these soap-like substances. And there are other anti-predation chemicals that are in different parts of plants. But
So are you saying if you sprout it, if you take like I love to make black lentil sprouts and mung bean sprouts. So when you sprout it, are you then getting rid of these proteins that the plant makes to make sure that it's not eaten in the wild? Is that
you're dramatically reducing the amounts of those? Yeah.
Oh,
and that's where somebody who even some people traditionally soaked, sprouted, fermented breads, Ezekiel breads, and then also sourdough bread, like the traditional methods of sourdough bread production. They would take these wheat kernels, soak them, pour off the soak water, soak them again, allow them to sprout a little bit, and then they would dry it and mill it. And then when they are producing the bread, they have a type of naturally occurring yeast that is very, very good at breaking down the gluten protein specifically.
Right. So some people can handle sourdough, but still
correct.
Many people can't. It's not everybody. Right.
So what you find is in traditional cultures, they are eating these foods, but in a way that is very, very different than the way that we prepare them in modern settings. Like the modern bread that we get, the varieties of wheat that we have more in the United States have a higher gluten content to start off with. And then they also will extract gluten and then enrich the flour. And it's awesome for like baked goods. Like this is that sticky, kind of cool nature that this stuff has. It's really, really cool for baked goods. It has an amazing mouthfeel, but folks are getting exposed to much, much higher levels of these gluten particles than what they did in the past.
Well, what about in India and in places where people mainly eat a vegetarian diet and they've been eating legumes? Like I lived in India for a year on my trek to learn Ayurvedic medicine and answer the questions, what is life all about? And it seems like they consume a huge amount. They have dal, they have lentils, they have beans every single day, but they're not having any higher incidence of gastroenterologic diseases than we are. So can you explain that a little bit? Or are you just saying that wouldn't necessarily be true? They're still having westernized diseases. It's confusing to me because now I am consuming more of just grain, very little, but like quinoa. And then I make my own my own chapati out of chickpea flour. And I let it sit for a while. And then I cook it at a very high heat. And I'm consuming these foods and I'm doing better than I was when I wasn't doing that. So it's a little bit confusing. So I'm just trying to get a handle on it.
And again, this is where we have exceptions to all situations. So
it
my
varies.
wife, my wife does pretty well on carbs, but she can also eat a ketogenic diet. And there's absolutely no difference in her performance, her cognition. She doesn't suffer the keto flu. She's very metabolically flexible. I'm not. And
I love that term. Okay.
Yeah. And so this is where people love to take these big picture concepts, write them in stone, create religious dogma, and then there's absolutely no flexibility for anything else. I will say this though, the third book that I wrote, Sacred Cow, which looks at the ethical, environmental, and health considerations of a meat-inclusive diet. I co-authored this with my good friend Diana Rogers. We really dug deep into the health of these kind of vegetarian populations in India. It's not good, and it's getting worse as they eat more and more refined foods. I would say that and what's interesting about these folks is they tend to display type 2 diabetes absent obesity, and this is something that has been really throwing a curveball to folks. They tend not to become obese prior to type 2 diabetes. They tend not to gain weight prior to developing hypertension and whatnot. So there's some different genetic and epigenetic stories that are going on there, but there's a non-trivial amount of westernized diseases in these areas. Now, that said, they are also industrializing and changing rapidly. The gut microbiome is a huge piece of this story. And as devastating as unsanitary water can be, it can kill people. There's also probably some upside to just the microbiological exposure that people are getting. And then this hygiene hypothesis is this idea that we're living in an ever more clean and sanitized environment, and that this may have some downsides for health. So is a piece of this story that Indians, as they become more industrialized, become wealthier, are getting access to both better water and also more refined food. So I think that all of those could be playing into this process and leading to some deteriorating health outcomes.
Can you make some comments about the growing use of veganism and carnivore, the pure carnivore diet that's touted by a medical doctor? I couldn't find any articles on it, but I actually have a nurse practitioner in one of my memberships who's in the same building as the medical doctor who wrote that, and his wife, who just gave birth to a baby and only ate meat in her entire pregnancy and is doing well. I know Rita Marie Lascalzo sent me a little note. She went, "Have you heard of this? Is there any science behind it?" Because we're all talking about it. Can you comment on those two diverse diets, veganism and carnivorism?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we dug into the veganism pretty heavily, because clearly that is touted as being more ethical, more sustainable. It's claimed that it's healthier. It's interesting. Prior to about the 1920s, 1930s, there were no vegans on the planet. Now, there were more vegetarian type societies like in India, but veganism is a very, very recent kind of I don't want to say more extreme, but it takes this idea that animal products are bad or evil or injurious to an even more extreme level. And so it's a relatively new development. I've seen some people really thrive on it. I've seen people thrive on it for a while and then absolutely crater. But I would have to say that 70% of the folks that end up following my work are kind of recovering vegans. Like they did it for some period of time, often for ethical reasons, sometimes for health related reasons. And then they end up just having a heck of a problem with it. In Europe, it's considered child abuse to put a child or a pregnant or breastfeeding mother on a vegan diet, because very well recognized as being too nutrient deficient to long chain essential fats, EPA and DHA. There are some people that do a good job of converting something like seed oils into the longer forms, but that really varies from person
only
to
30% of the population, not even half, right?
Yeah. Zinc, iron, and B vitamin deficiencies are pretty endemic in these folks. And this was another interesting thing about vegetarian populations. They also tended to suffer these kind of nutrient deficiency scenarios. So I think some people can do better on a vegetarian or vegan diet. It absolutely has to be supplemented. There's no two ways around the vegan diet. Like you have to supplement with a minimum of B12, usually some zinc and iron, and then oftentimes for many people the long chain omega-3 fats. You can get vegan sources from distilled concentrated seaweed sources for the DHA, but it's pretty expensive and fairly involved deal. The carnivore idea is really interesting. When I first, I've seen these kind of zero carb camps around low carb and paleo for a long time, but I kind of dismissed them like, that's just kind of crazy. And I actually developed the concept of the autoimmune paleo diet. So it was taking the basic premise of the paleo diet, another degree of severity or intervention, and really looking at things like nightshades and the seeds of plants and the peels of plants as potentially being immunogenic, because those, even like lettuce or cucumbers or what have you, most of the anti-predation chemicals are in the outside. And so I developed this autoimmune paleo diet to help the people for whom they have an autoimmune or gut-related issue. They went paleo. They maybe had some improvement, but not full improvement in their situation. And what was fascinating to me is I started encountering people who had shifted into a carnivore diet. They were consuming effectively zero or very, very little plant material, maybe a little bit of fruit here and there. And they were putting autoimmune disease in remission. And they were going from crippled due to rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis to completely regaining their health and getting their health back. So I really started off rather skeptical in thinking this is absolutely crazy, to really digging into this stuff. And it's interesting. There are multiple year-long interventions that have been done where people are fed nothing other than meat, and they motor along just fine. They don't suffer nutrient deficiencies. They're not low in vitamin C. They're not really deficient in anything else. There is no singular plant material that you could feed a human being that they wouldn't end up dying within a year from nutrient deficiencies. So it is really fascinating in that regard that grazing ruminant flesh might be a one-stop shop nutritionally, and you just can't say the same thing about literally any type of plant food. Like, you have to start getting very mosaic in the way that you eat.
Do you know anyone who's been eating like that for like 5 years or 10 years?
There's some examples of people eating like this 22 years.
Of just meat, just different kinds of meat, but they eat organ meats too. Right,
some
they
of
eat
them
all
do.
The meats. Some of them do.
Some of them do. Not all of them do. And that's a whole interesting side note too.
With all our emphasis on vegetables, it makes your mind, you have to take your mind out of, I love that comment by Elon Musk, who said the sign of a true genius is being willing to look at things differently. And so we're looking at food here now differently. We're wondering if just meat could be something. And you're saying that there have been people who've been eating it for over 2 decades that have been successful. So how come you're not then eating that way? Why are you then, since you're less carb tolerant?
I'm pretty darn close to carnivore. So I'll do a little bit of berries. I'll do a little bit of carrots. It's funny because I too was of the opinion you got to eat a lot of vegetables. You got to feed your gut microbiome and all this stuff. And I feel best pretty, what I would say, peri-carnivore or carnivore-ish. I have reduced my plant intake over time and I just feel better. But some days it's just like, I just want a goddamn salad, or something like that. But when I do those things, like my wife makes a really cool and awesome tasting salad dressing where it's apple cider vinegar, olive oil, a mountain of salt. And then I will put that on the salad about 4 hours before I eat it. And it really breaks it down. And I still notice, like, I've never had constipation in my life. I'm always more on the loose side. I will notice that will kind of make things a little bit dodgier the next day. And like, if my stress is higher, if my sleep is poor, then all of those things tend to come together and make it worse. One interesting thing, when I lived in Texas, because of the amount of sunlight and heat that I got, my digestion was better. This is one of the things that now living in Montana, I bought a Spurdy vitamin D lamp, and we're getting a sauna and all this stuff. So I'm really going to try to emulate some of that. But I eat near carnivore. I do a little bit of fruit. I do a little bit of root vegetable stuff here and there, a little bit of dark chocolate, but that's really about it. Like, and every once in a while I'll have something like a really cooked down salad cooked with acid. Or if I make a soup or a stew, I will
acid. You mean by vinegar or something like that?
Yeah.
Or lemon juice or something. Okay. Yep. He's not talking about acid, not dropping acid, but using acid forming foods. Okay.
Right. Yeah. But so the vegetable matter that I do have is pretty limited now. And I personally, I feel far better on it. And, it's interesting following my kids. They crush protein of all types. They love fruit. They'll do carrots. They'll do a little bit of potatoes here and there and stuff like that, sweet potatoes. And I cook some amazing veggies. Like, I'll take all the schmaltz off of a chicken.
What's your favorite veggie? You going to tell us how to make it right now?
Probably asparagus. And I'll use like some sort of bacon fat or like buffalo tallow or something, and really sear it in that. And I love it. The kids absolutely crush it. But
what do you do with the chicken schmaltz? I'm sorry, I started to interrupt you just when you had because my grandmother in her grave said, ask him. She was Yiddish and she'd always cook with chicken schmaltz.
I'll grate up some carrots, cut some cabbage, and it just tastes amazing. And the kids will pick at it and like, yeah, it's really, really good for vegetables. And then they're just kind of like, and what's interesting is if you look at the nutritional composition of fruits versus vegetables, there's virtually nothing in either that isn't in the other. So if somebody mainly eats a variety of fruit and they don't want to eat veggies, I think they're going to be fine with that. If they mainly eat veggies and don't do well with fruit, then I think they're going to be fine with that too. But it's interesting, like both girls are very kind of protein centric. And again, I always put a variety of stuff out there for them, and they're like 99th percentile in height, 45th percentile in weight, real strong, real active. They do well in our homeschooling and all that. So it's interesting to me what the kids gravitate towards and what things they kind of eschew. And the vegetables, they'll do asparagus, they'll do carrots, some things cooked in a soup, but I've got to really just cook the heck out of it, and they will do a salad. They'll do a salads if there's a good vinaigrette or like that salad dressing that my wife makes. They will smash a salad if it's got the right dressing on it, but that's really about it for them.
Well, Rob, let me just tell you a little bit about my story, and I'd love to hear your comments on this. So I've been looking at diets every which way for many decades. And I started out for a few years as a vegan, and you're pronouncing it vegan. I'm not sure, Rose by any other name. And that didn't really work for me. And then I went vegetarian for 20 some years. And that I felt I needed to add some meat back in. And I ended up being much more paleo, and because it makes a lot of sense to me. And my lipids started going out of control. And my mother was given a very powerful drug when she was pregnant with me called diethylstilbestrol. And many of my issues in my life have been from that in utero exposure. So my lipids were out of control, and I had a kidney removed, and I had kidney disease, and no one knew why, even though I lived perfectly. And I had some other issues like an eye disease. And I bumped into, at a functional medicine conference, molecules that I now refer to as the molecules of mass destruction, molecules that drive disease. And one molecule in particular, TMAO, it stands for trimethylamine N oxide. So I decided, and I'm doing gut panels on myself. I've got great bacteria. I do probiotics. I make my own kimchi from scratch. I do all this stuff. And I've been eating this way and exercising and trying to be mindful for many decades of my life, most of my life. And I was really having many health issues that weren't responding to what other people get response from. So when I ran my TMAO level, it was higher than the lab had ever seen. And I called up the researchers who did the original research on diethylstilbestrol and said, have you ever heard of offspring that were exposed in the womb? And they go, oh, yeah, they all have elevated TMAO and elevated galectin-3 and elevated asymmetric dimethylarginine and symmetric they have all these molecules. We didn't know what to make of it. But those molecules drive damage. Maybe they don't drive damage in everyone because TMAO is kind of controversial since fish can even elevate it. So I went and looked on Paleo and PubMed. And I found from an Australian medical center where they put 44 people on a paleo diet. And after a month, they looked at TMAO levels in women, and it was no different than people who weren't eating a paleo diet. But after a year, when they looked at both men and women, they had much higher levels of TMAO, which we now think drive stroke and drive heart disease. And maybe it doesn't do it in everyone because it's controversial, kind of like the French paradox with wine, because fish, which are considered heart-friendly food, can elevate TMAO. But for me,
they elevate it higher than any other food known.
Anything.
Yeah.
But when I lowered my TMAO, which only I could achieve if I stopped eating meat and fish, I let myself have turkey once a week or a little bit here and there because I miss it. Then my TMAO levels came down, and within 6 months, for the first time in 16 years, I had no kidney disease. I have no eye issues. I can see better than I've seen in several decades. So for me, I didn't get enough resistant starch. So I think what I'm hearing, I love that term of your wife, that she has metabolic flexibility. Maybe I would have to go about this in a little different way because I have there's these nuances that each of us have. But I wanted you to address this TMAO thing because it's been the bugaboo for me. And because I would rather prefer eating a more paleo type diet. And here I am, but I'm feeling better. I feel like I'm 25 years old and can leap tall buildings in a single bound. But I wanted your comments on this.
Yeah. And I mean, it's at the end of the day, this is where the clinical outcome is really where the buck stops. It doesn't matter what the theory is. If somebody's feeling poorer on any given intervention, then it doesn't matter. And we see this within all dietary circles, whether it's paleo or vegan or carnivore. You see people struggling, and then oftentimes the community around them is like, well, you just need to do it longer. You're just detoxing. And I think that stuff's bullshit. Like, it's very injurious, and we should be open to people tinkering and fiddling with all this stuff. TMAO specifically is one of these things that is fascinating to me because, again, and oftentimes in the vegan circles, they will roll the TMAO deal out. But even the most ardent of these folks, the Joel Kahns, the John McDougall's and whatnot, you can paint them into a corner with fish, where it's like, well, every study that's ever been done, fish is good for you, right? And they'll hem and
fish paradox.
Yeah, and then the TMAO is shockingly elevated with fish. I find TMAO to be more of I think there's something else going on, and TMAO is along for the ride. I don't know that TMAO is like the causative factor in that story, but it's more, so we were looking at homocysteine for a long time in cardiovascular disease. It's not the homocysteine that's a problem. It's the reason why homocysteine is elevated that's the problem.
The methylation issue, right?
Yeah, the methylation issue and whatnot. And then interestingly, just jamming people full of a bunch of methylated B vitamins brought down homocysteine and didn't necessarily address underlying cardiovascular disease problems. So again, it could be something that is correlative but not causative. And I think in many situations that's likely the case here. And so it becomes one of these things where I'm not really sure what to make of TMAO specifically, But clearly in your situation, you've found a way of eating and living where you feel better. And that's really for me, that's where it all stops, and so you've gone through almost this kind, like you drop a marble in one of those things and it like bounces and sorts. It's like a logic tree. And so did vegan work? Kind of for a while. Did vegetarian work? Is a little better. You reintroduce some animal products. Well, we had this other problem. And so you just keep kind of sorting and sifting with that. It is interesting. I see people who just thrive with much larger amounts of fermentable fiber. I have tried every way from Sunday to work fermentable fiber into my diet supplementation, and it just wrecks me. Gassy, bloated, foggy headed. I'll run it for a month. And I've really tinkered with that stuff, and it's a non-starter for me. And I feel so bad with it that I'm kind of like, even if I'm going to die next week from the way I'm eating, at least the next week won't suck horribly. And I can die happy. Whereas this other stuff, like I just really don't feel good on it. But I think that this is where, so like we know the gut microbiome is important. We know that a healthy gut barrier is important. And in my opinion, that's about what we know. There are all these people that will claim, well, we'll do this test and then we'll do this and that. And I think it's just kind of a crapshoot. Like this is where you have to find a good clinician who's willing to just work towards good clinical endpoints. And for some people, like a fiber-free diet ends up being absolutely amazing. And sometimes they do that, like a carnivore intervention for 3 months, 6 months, and then they come back in and reintroduce plant foods and fermentable fiber, and they do great. And other people, that's just kind of where they end up being for the long haul. So I think that it's awesome what you've done, and that you've really run this huge arc of experimentation and have found something that works remarkably well for you. Both of my girls, I forgot to mention, they usually eat homemade sauerkraut and kimchi daily.
I hid it in the freezer when my refrigerator went out. I just had gallons that I had just made, and I had made black I had black Spanish radish. I had 30 different greens, and they all went bad because of the freeze and Abbott's blaming the green energy. Nasty, nasty, I was angry.
Right. Yeah. So it's I think that this is again where it's a highly individualized process to be able to auger down to that situation. Yeah.
Well, I love that you say that, because that is really where the rubber meets the road for me. It's really when I see a patient, my goal is to get them to feel better. I don't want to be Velcroed to any specific camp or thinking I should fit that patient into what I think I know that's true. And I especially want to honor the journey that they have tried and what hasn't worked, or what they feel, how they feel on a variety of things. And I love that you said that. There's individualism. There's, what works for you, because you're someone who has really helped get people more mindful about diet, but you also have the wisdom and the humility to say that it's really what works, and that might vary from person to person. I loved your term for your wife, who I want to get on the show. She sounds so incredible. Metabolic flexibility. So we have our own genetic footprint, and some people have a less flexible one than others. It turned out, when I've really teased the literature, that exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals, which the one my mother took was the main one that they test all the new ones coming down the pike, upregulated the enzyme that makes TMAO. It's FMO3. And so you can have an epigenetic glitch where you just make a whole bunch of it, more than the average camper, and then that's not good for you. So maybe when you add foods that make TMAO on their own, like fish, then it takes you way over the edge. But we're learning about all these things, but the proof is, one, how you feel. And if you've got kidney disease, do your markers improve, or do they not? If you have eye disease, what's your visual acuity? You have endpoints in practice to know if what you're doing is really getting well. So I am looking at TMAO in a lot of patients now. That's what I do in Naples. I look at all the molecules of mass destruction, and we're gathering the data. We don't totally know, but we're reversing long-standing serious illness. And if you have a diagnosis, if you're walking around with stage 3 diagnosis of kidney disease, no matter how good you feel less than and frail. And when you eliminate that, even if you're in in your 60s or 70s, you feel like you can just face the world from a totally more powerful position. So I love your openness and your depth of science and your honesty, so people understand they have to find what works for them. But it's so interesting to hear that even in your own family, you have different metabolisms and you have a little bit of different dietary intake. So when do you ever recommend, now that you just said with the carnivore, you birthed the autoimmune paleo intervention, and it was more carnivore. Who do you recommend that to? And do you have a program?
The autoimmune paleo is a ton of vegetables, actually. Like it's a mountain of vegetables.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I didn't get that.
And
okay.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that this carnivore intervention, I from my experience, we are just now in the next year going to see 3 clinical interventions of the carnivore diet for different health conditions. So we're really at the beginning of learning about this. It's worth mentioning that there was a time in the 1940s, there was a day when there was not a concept called the Mediterranean diet. And then there was a day when in a journal, there was a review paper published talking about the Mediterranean diet. And then there was almost nothing about the Mediterranean diet for another 5 years. And then there were a few more papers, and then 10 years went by, and then there was the first clinical interventions. And now the Mediterranean diet is this thing that's kind of ubiquitous within nutritional lore. But it's critical for people to remember that these ideas, whether it's paleo or keto or what have you, they have a genesis and an evolution of their own. And so people will dismiss something. They'll say, well, there's no research on this. And it's like, yeah. And at one point, there was no research on whatever your pet, dietary theory is. And that doesn't mean that we go headlong into it, but we can acknowledge the limitations of what our scientific situation is. But, there are some people who will say a million anecdote do not an ounce of data make. And I think that's kind of bullshit. Like if you drop a hammer on your foot and it hurts, we don't need to repeat that 1,000 times and get there is enough power in that statistical analysis that we're fairly convinced of it. And so more and more often, when I make a recommendation towards a carnivore type intervention, and, honestly, the main recommendation that I'm making more recently is just that people get adequate protein, which virtually nobody does. I recommend a gram of between these two spectrums, a gram of protein per pound of lean body mass on up to a gram of protein per pound of body weight. And
can you give us an example of what that would be in an average size man or woman, and how that translates into how much protein you're eating a little bit throughout the day, like a few ounces of fish, just so someone has an idea of what that means?
So I'm 165 pounds and about 10% body fat. And so if I'm eating to the gram of protein per pound of lean body mass, and it's about 154 pounds, so about 150 grams of protein, on up to maybe about as high as 170 grams of protein per day. An ounce of lean meat is about 7 grams of protein. So it usually means getting some sort of dense protein source, 7 to 8 ounces of protein 3 times a day for me.
And so I'm dealing in Naples with people with renal disease, and they're not supposed to eat that much because the kidney doesn't like nitrogen when it's unhealthy, not when it's healthy. So are there any caveats with that? Because we're seeing an epidemic of kidney disease, an epidemic of increased incidence of people needing to go for dialysis. I worked at the dialysis center here for almost 10 years. That started me off on a lot of all of this. So can you comment on that? Because Dr. Moncrief was always hitting me over the head. You can't give people too much protein because it'll harm their kidneys. So you're not seeing that in your plan?
No, and I would also throw out there's some really fascinating literature on ketogenic diets in stage renal conditions, or say like stage 3, and pulling people back. I would make the case that a lot of that is hyperinsulinemia driven, and so the advanced glycation end products from high blood glucose levels and whatnot are problematic. And it appears that ketone bodies themselves may act as a recovery fuel for both neurological tissue and renal tissue. So if you do a little bit of poking around, like renal disease, ketogenic diet, there's some fascinating controlled trials that have been done. And so it may be another tool in the tool chest that could be used. What I'm recommending is a higher protein diet in healthy individuals, no existing renal disease. They've fed people double the amount that I'm recommending, and what it does is it actually improves renal function. It's fascinating. Again, this is a very different story though than talking about somebody who's in a legitimately diseased state. So. Yeah, and what
I'm going to poke into this, and I'm going to write you, and I'd like to keep this dialogue going if you don't mind.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
I'm just looking to see what are the ways, and I'm just very open-minded, but we've been trained to make it less, but I'm not. So, and we're just in the stage of gathering data, so I'm very interested to take a look at this in the literature. Thank you for guiding me in that direction.
Yeah, and a classic ketogenic diet is going to actually be much lower in protein than what I was just recommending. So it would be more along the lines of like 85, maybe 100 grams of protein for the same like 165-pound individual. So it tends, and you can take it lower protein than that. What I find challenging on low protein diets across the board is that people just tend to overeat whatever else is there. And if they're on a low carb diet and they're eating too little protein, they'll eat too much fat and they'll have problems with that. If they're eating a higher carb diet and they eat too little protein, then they will have problems there. There's this idea called the protein leverage hypothesis that makes the case that protein-rich foods tend to be both the most nutrient dense and also the most satiating. And so most organisms eat to a protein minimum, and once they hit that protein minimum, they're good. Their satiety is activated, and they tend not to then overeat. And this is kind of in human nutrition where I think animal products really perform remarkably well, because you get a lot of protein per calorie and a lot of additional nutrition that comes along for the ride at the same time. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I've been looking forward to this for a long time, because you're one of the people who are really moving and shaking in such a positive way, and the earth needs more thinkers like you right now, because we're all hurting deeply, and it's very good to get solid, sane, livable information that we can start using right away, and to hear people who have looked at it from a scientific and also clinical, and then have written books, and then have trained professionals, so that when you do that, you have an understanding of the knowledge on so many different portals, and then you bring that together in our discussion. It's very enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Promise me I can have your wife on the show too.
She will do it at some point. Yeah, we're still just getting our feet under us from a 2,000-mile cross-country move. So we will definitely make that happen. She has a great story to tell. She co-founded a tech company, and I would not be doing what I'm doing. The millions of people that I've been able to help, that would have never happened had I not had her support and guidance and insight on so many things. So yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I love to hear your teamship. That's really great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. This has been a lot to digest, and we don't need digestive enzymes to digest this information. Just need to be taken for a walk or sitting or relaxing on a couch. But this is the kind of show that should be passed forward. And don't forget to go to drlindseyberkson.com/membership, because I now have a growing group of people, because I missed lecturing so much, that I lecture to on a regular basis to keep up with what's happening in the nutritional and hormone world, and how you can translate that into your patient care and to your own family's health. So don't forget about that. And if you love shows like this, don't forget at the end of all of the show notes, there are ways to give us a review so we can pass this information forward. And we're going to have at the bottom of the show notes here for Robb, we're going to have links to his books. We're going to have links to his website. We're going to have links to his wife's information, so that if your interest got piqued by any of this, you have access, and you should go out and read this, because he has, as he just said, and it's really true, he's influenced millions, and he's a thinker, but he's an open-minded thinker. I'm so sick of opinionated thinkers. It's such a pleasure to have an open-minded thinker. So
thank you.
Hope you're my new friend, and I wish you well.
Thank you, Doc.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.